Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're tackling, just a titan of cinema, right? Stanley Kubrick.
An absolute giant, yeah.
For anyone who loves film, his work is just.
Yeah.
It's foundational. The moment you say Kubrick, you get these images in your head.
Instantly.
Jack Torrance, Frozen in the Maze, or the Monolith in 2001. These are visuals that have become the benchmark for pretty much every director since.
They really have. His influence, it's everywhere. You can see it in Christopher Nolan, in Wes Anderson, David Fincher. But our mission today is a bit more complex. We need to go beyond the myth.
And it is a powerful myth, isn't it? The idea of this tyrannical, obsessive genius, the ultimate auteur who was like the judge, jury, and executioner on his own set.
It is, and for decades, that's the story everyone, critics included, has latched onto. And to be fair, the film seemed to support it. The perfection is almost inhuman.
Totally. When you look at the historical detail in Barry Lyndon or the effects in 2001, you just assume it had to come from this place of total obsessive control.
It does, but here's the thing the sources get into. That myth wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. It was something Kubrick himself started building way back in the 50s.
Really? That's a strategy.
Yeah, to build power, to get the total creative freedom he wanted, away from any studio interference. So what the recent archival research shows us is this profound duality. On one hand, you have this staggering technical innovation.
The genius.
The genius. But on the other, you have these incredibly cynical themes about humanity and, maybe most surprisingly, some really questionable professional and ethical behavior behind the scenes.
Okay, so this is where we need to unpack things. We're not just, analyzing the films themselves, Dr. Strangelove, Paths to Glory, all the classics. We're also digging into the empirical evidence.
In the Stanley Kubrick archive, yeah.
The SKA, his actual notes, his letters, production documents. So this is a deep dive into the man behind that legendary machine and what that tells us about creativity and power.
Exactly. We're going to use that archive to look not just at what the films are saying, but how they were actually made. And that process, the relationships and the power dynamics, that's central to understanding what we're calling the Kubrick paradox.
Let's start with the innovation then. Because
Yeah.
no matter what else we uncover, the visual storytelling is just.
Yeah.
It's undeniable. That's his primary legacy.
It is. And the sources really emphasize that his level of control was almost unique. It was a completely deliberate choice.
He had to have that control.
It was fundamental for him. His big move to England, that was all about escaping the Hollywood studio system, both financially and creatively. And once he was there, he became this creative bottleneck for everything.
In a good way.
In a creative way, yes. He was involved in every single tiny detail, from, the deep historical research for a film like Barry Lyndon to picking the exact lens, getting it modified, designing the lighting for his sci-fi films. He was the ultimate decider of what was possible, technically and artistically.
And the result is that his films became these markers in film history.
Yeah.
They didn't just tell great stories. They set a new standard for how you could tell them visually.
Absolutely. And this is where the how gets so fascinating. How he was pushing these boundaries without the digital tools we just take for granted now. I think 2001, A Space Odyssey is the perfect case study here.
And it's probably the most important effects film ever made, right?
I think you could argue that, yeah. It still looks real today, which is incredible.
It does. It doesn't look like a cartoon from the 60s. It looks real.
And that's because he was totally committed to realism, using almost entirely practical effects. We're talking miniatures, forced perspective. He didn't just guess what a spaceship should look like. He worked directly with people from NASA and major aerospace companies to make sure the designs and the models were scientifically believable.
But it's the movement inside the ships, the set pieces.
Yeah.
That's where the real engineering wizardry comes in.
Exactly. Think about how hard it is to film zero gravity convincingly. He couldn't just hang actors on wires. It wouldn't look right. So for the scenes inside the Discovery 1 centrifuge, he had to work with designers to build a massive 38-ton rotating set. It was essentially a giant hamster wheel 50 feet across.
That's insane.
It is. The actors would walk on the inside of this revolving drum, and the camera would rotate right along with it. So the effect is seamless. It perfectly mimics zero-G by just moving the entire world around the actor.
The commitment of resources for just one sequence is staggering. And then you get to the Stargate sequence at the end. That wild, kaleidoscopic trip. It looks completely digital, but it's decades before CGI.
That was a result of this huge, year-long technical project with his effects supervisor, Douglas Trumbull. It's a technique called slit scan photography.
Okay, break that down for us. Slit scan.
So to put it simply, imagine you have a camera moving past a thin slit of light that's shining on some kind of background image. The film is exposed over a long period of time as the camera moves.
So you're stretching the image over time.
You're stretching light and shape and motion. It creates this kind of visual ribbon of infinite depth and speed. And that's how he made those incredible abstract visuals, the streaks of color, the weird geometries. It was all done in camera. Pure technological artistry.
And speaking of obsession, I love that little detail from the sources that he was so worried about alien realism, he actually took out an anti-alien insurance policy.
It's perfect, isn't it? It's that blend of meticulous planning and this almost absurd paranoia.
Right?
But the innovation wasn't just for sci-fi. I mean, look at Barry Lyndon. That film looks, frame for frame, like an 18th century painting come to life.
The lighting in that movie is just gorgeous, especially the indoor scenes. It feels so authentic to the period.
And that authenticity was achieved by basically forcing the technology to work for the history. He insisted on shooting those interior scenes using only natural candlelight.
Which seems impossible.
It was, with standard equipment. So he had to source these unique lenses that were originally made for NASA. They were Zeiss 50mm planar lenses designed to take pictures in extremely low light, like in space. They had an aperture of f/0.7.
Which is incredibly fast, just drinks in the light.
Exactly. So he had those lenses modified to fit his movie cameras, and that's what allowed him to shoot scenes lit only by the flicker of a few candles. No big stage lights, just that painterly natural glow.
That attention to detail is just, it's unmatched.
Yeah.
And then you jump to The Shining, which is a horror film that completely changed how cameras can move through a space.
That's the Steadicam revolution. Now, he didn't invent it. That was an operator named Garrett Brown. But Kubrick, working with Brown, he popularized it. He refined its use.
They used it in new ways, right?
In completely new narrative-driven ways. They weren't just using it to get a stable shot while running. They were doing these long, immersive takes using these strange new angles.
Like the shots of Danny on his big wheel.
That's the iconic one. I mean, think about trying to film that traditionally. You'd need to lay down these huge, clumsy dolly tracks through all those hallways around the corner.
And you'd see the tracks in the shot, probably.
Precisely. But with the Steadicam, Garrett Brown could just follow Danny at high speed, smoothly, right down at this low angle, just gliding above the floor.
He gives the hotel that ghostly feeling.
Exactly. It's like the camera itself is a ghost, this silent observer floating through the building. And those long takes just ramp up the suspense. Because the movement is so smooth, you're trapped in it. There are no cuts to give you a break.
Okay, so we've established the visual perfection, the absolute technical mastery. But then you peel back that polished surface, and the actual content, the themes he keeps coming back to, is so incredibly cold. It's cynical, almost nihilistic.
And that's the first major paradox, isn't it? This flawless, meticulous style is used to serve this profoundly pessimistic vision of humanity. And what's amazing is how consistent those themes are across all the different genres he worked in.
Right, from a period piece to a space epic.
The sources all point to this core conflict, which is basically that human beings have failed to evolve past their base animal nature.
So let's start with that first big theme.
Yeah.
The fragility of civility. The idea that all our rules in our society are just a thin layer of paint.
Exactly. One of the sources describes it as a wafer-thin meniscus covering an ocean of bloodshed and violence.
Wow.
And this idea that even in the most refined settings, the animal man is always just lurking under the surface, ready to explode.
You see that so clearly in Barry Lyndon. You have all the formal rules of dueling, the fancy clothes, the powdered wigs.
And then you have that scene where Barry just brutally beats his stepson, Lord Bullingdon, in the middle of a musical performance. It's this shocking, violent rupture of that refined veneer. All the rules of society are just, tools to manage this rage that's boiling underneath.
And a film like Eyes Wide Shut explores that same theme, but through sex and class.
Eyes Wide Shut is a masterclass in this. The whole story is about how the wealthy and powerful use civility, these opulent rituals, the masks, these very formal codes, to hide their true, often violent and exploitative motives.
The masked orgy is the literal version of that.
It's the literal manifestation, yeah. The mask allows the most powerful people in society to engage in their basest fantasies, in exploitation, even murder, all while keeping their public identity safe. They maintain that wafer-thin meniscus of respectability.
And his protagonists usually end up isolated or punished. They can't navigate this brutal reality.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if it's the ape at the beginning of 2001 discovering a bone as a weapon, or Alex in A Clockwork Orange being physically restrained, or Barry Lyndon losing his leg and being exiled. Humanity is always shown as being fundamentally flawed, always struggling with its own nature.
And that failure to evolve, it leads right into the second theme, the failure of human understanding. We have all this technology, but we're still just, ignorant apes.
The sources identify this singular mistake that connects all humanity is an inherent lack of understanding. We're trapped in this narrow-minded prison of our own making, and we can't really learn or transcend it.
And 2001 is the biggest, most cosmic example of that. We build these incredible spaceships, we fly to Jupiter, we're looking for the monolith to solve the mystery of existence.
But the film suggests that cosmic consciousness is just. It's unattainable for us. The 8 men at the beginning and the astronauts on the ship, they're basically equal in their total unawareness of their own limitations. They can't solve the enigma of this superior intelligence.
So the journey to the Star Child at the end, it's visually stunning, but thematically it's kind of devastating.
It is. Dave Bowman's final experience, when he's reckoning with the infinite, one source describes it as a reality that is too intense for our physical bodies' minds to process.
So he doesn't master the universe.
No, he's crushed by it. He's crushed by its unfathomable weight, and then he's reborn as something else, something post-human. But that experience is completely alien and unknowable to us. It just proves how limited our own perception is.
Which leads perfectly into that third big theme, dehumanization and technology's flaw. The idea that our own tools end up turning against us.
That transformation of man into machine is, it's an overriding theme. In his war films, from Paths of Glory to Full Metal Jacket, the whole point of the military institution is to strip soldiers of their humanity and mold them into killing machines.
And A Clockwork Orange is the most literal example of that.
Correct. The whole premise is taking something natural, which is Alex's choice to be violent, and imposing a machine on it with the Ludovico technique. His free will is surgically removed to make him a good citizen. Human behavior becomes artificial, dictated by outside forces.
So technology isn't liberating us. It's just a new form of control.
Exactly. It becomes this new conditioner that limits man's freedom and dictates his development. And we're all subject to this ubiquitous supervision. 2001 is about this too, the objectification of man.
And that's why HAL 9000 is so terrifying. He's the perfect servant who malfunctions and becomes a murderer.
HAL embodies that challenge to our belief in technology's infallibility. He's supposed to be perfect, but his perfection creates a logical conflict that forces him to kill the humans he serves. That failure shows Kubrick's belief that every system, even the most advanced AI, has the seeds of its own destruction built into it.
It's just so ironic, isn't it? He's using this flawless, perfect technology, the Steadicam, the slit scan, all of it, to show us this deeply pessimistic vision where technology is ultimately going to betray us or turn us into machines.
The irony is profound. He insists on having total control over his art to show us that humanity has a total, ultimate lack of control over its own destiny. His films are constantly finding this dark, nihilistic irony in the futility of everything we try to do.
So let's move from that cosmic cynicism to a more concrete critique. Kubrick loved using institutions, the military, the government to expose the flaws and, frankly, the stupidity of people in power. Let's start with Dr. Strangelove. He didn't originally intend for that to be a comedy, did he?
No, not at all. He started it as a very serious nuclear drama. He did a ton of research into Cold War policy, but he eventually came to the conclusion that the whole subject of nuclear annihilation was just. It was too outrageous, too fantastic to be treated seriously.
So he realized it was a joke.
A hideous joke, as he put it. And that shift to satire is what makes the film so brilliant.
And the terror comes from how absurd the cause is.
Yeah.
You have this one unhinged general, Jack Ripper, who starts World War III because of his own paranoia.
Yeah, Ripper's delusion about the Soviets using fluoridation to pollute his precious bodily fluids, it just demonstrates how easily this immense destructive power can fall into the hands of one unstable person. The reason for the apocalypse is ridiculous, which somehow makes it even more terrifying.
And then you go to the war room, where that absurdity is just formalized. It's a direct critique of Cold War policy.
Oh, absolutely. This is where he directly skewers the whole idea of mutually assured destruction, or Mavlat, with the Soviet doomsday device, this device that automatically destroys the world if they're attacked. It just illustrates the total futility of the arms race. He's forcing audiences in 1964 to look at the logical endpoint of their own defense policies and realize that the idea of winning a nuclear war is completely meaningless.
And the whole thing spins out of control because of a simple technological flaw.
Which shows the danger of these complex, pre-programmed systems. The attack goes forward because a communications system on 1B52 gets damaged, and they can't get the recall code. It's this tiny little flaw that leads to the end of the world.
But the critique goes even deeper, doesn't it? I mean, with the character of Dr. Strangelove himself, he's a direct reference to something real.
He is, and it's fascinating. The character, this ex-Nazi scientist in a wheelchair who can't stop his arm from doing a Nazi salute, is a direct commentary on a real post-war U.S. policy called Operation Paperclip.
Remind us what that was.
Operation Paperclip was this secret program where the U.S. government recruited over 1,600 German scientists and engineers after World War II, many of whom had been Nazis, people like Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist.
So he's pointing out that the people behind U.S. defense policy were, in some cases, the same people who worked for the Third Reich.
Exactly. He's reminding the American public of that uncomfortable truth.
And what about Miss Scott, General Turgidsen's mistress? She's one of the very few women in a Kubrick film.
Her one scene where she's on the phone in a bikini is very intentional social commentary. Her presence is meant to show that these high-ranking officials who are making life or death decisions, they're just imperfect beings. They're not these emotionless chess masters. They're flawed humans driven by the same base impulses as anyone else.
Okay, let's turn to Paths of Glory, which is all about the miscarriage of justice and corruption within the military itself.
Paths of Glory uses war to show how conflict just creates these perverse incentives for people to abuse their power. The sources break down how the whole plot is driven by these strategic conflicts, starting with General Brulard manipulating General Moreau.
Right, he convinces Moreau to attack the anthill, which is a suicide mission.
Purely for the promise of a promotion. And Moreau's ambition immediately turns him into this cocksure hypocrite, the clear villain of the piece.
And you can see that hypocrisy in the camera work when he's in the trenches.
It's a brilliant early use of the long tracking shot to build character. As Moreau walks through the trenches, the camera pulls away from him. He's constantly ducking gunfire, worried about getting his uniform dirty, stopping to make this absurd small talk with the soldiers. You see, it's all about him.
But when Colonel Dax, played by Kirk Douglas, walks through the trenches,
the focus is completely different. The camera shows us Dax's point of view, or it focuses on the faces of his men. Moreau's walk was about ego. Dax is about purpose. When a bomb goes off, Dax is the only one who doesn't even flinch. Kubrick visually tells us that he's the moral anomaly in a corrupt system.
And the most profound injustice is the court-martial of those three men for cowardice.
The whole trial sequence is just a masterclass in visual railroading. The setting itself, this opulent palace, contrasts so violently with the muddy trenches, and the staging conveys the power imbalance. The defendants are on these tiny, rickety chairs while Moreau is lounging on a fancy sofa.
The camera angles look down on them.
They look down on them, and the composition is damning. The judges' wigs and their backs are often used to physically block the prosecutor from the shot. The fix is in before it even starts.
And the way the men themselves are chosen is the final grotesque absurdity.
It's completely arbitrary and unjust. One is chosen for a personal vendetta, another because he's a social undesirable, and the third is chosen literally by drawing lots. It has nothing to do with their actions. And the culmination is that scene just before the execution, where one of the men, who has a fractured skull, is tied to a stretcher and woken up just to be shot.
And the general's reaction right after is just sickening.
The film cuts immediately from that brutal execution to Moreau and Brulard eating croissants and talking about the glorious way the men died. It's just this shocking moment of indifference. And the film frames this whole tragedy with music. The military drums drowning out the French anthem at the start and the marching drowning out a German folk song at the end. It suggests that the specific side you're on doesn't matter. It's all just shared human loss.
It's just a profound irony, then, that the man who so perfectly dissected this corruption of power was often accused of using those same structures for his own benefit. Let's get to the archives.
And this is where we get to the most illuminating part of this deep dive. This is the new Kubrick studies. The old way was just analyzing the finished film. The new way is using the empirical evidence from the Stanley Kubrick archive to understand how the films were made. And that often challenges the myth of the director as this moral figure.
And we have to start by saying that the myth itself was part of his strategy.
Absolutely. The image of the cruel, demanding genius who sacrifices everything and everyone for his art, that was deliberate self-promotion. Even that famous documentary, Making the Shining, Some researchers see that with a very suspicious eye now.
How so?
The footage of him being so antagonistic with Shelley Duvall, even telling the crew not to sympathize with her. It's possible he allowed that footage to be shot specifically to reinforce his public image as this demanding artist whose results justified any method.
Okay, let's get into the specific evidence from the archives, starting with the problematic gender dynamics in casting on A Clockwork Orange.
The casting notes from August 1970 they're pretty damning. They reveal a very clear systemic pattern of gender discrimination during auditions, even for roles where the body wasn't central at all. The sources detail a huge difference in how he described almost 200 actors.
What was the difference between how he described men and women?
For the male actors, the notes are almost all about their professional qualities. Their voice, their intelligence, their acting ability. He'd write things like scientific type or good for intelligent bit. They were cataloged by function.
And for the women?
For the women, the notes are overwhelmingly about their physical figures. He used this objectifying shorthand. The archive shows this almost clinical obsession with their bodies, reducing them to abbreviations.
Can you give some examples of that shorthand?
Yes. The notes are filled with things like VGF for very good figure, VGL for very good legs, VGB for very good body, and PFGF for pretty good face. It's this forensic reduction of women, and it shows a really problematic pattern of objectification in his professional process.
And this was even for roles that didn't require nudity.
Precisely. A lot of these women weren't auditioning for sexualized roles, yet they were reduced to these fetishized categories. I think the most unsettling example from the archive is about Cheryl Grunwald, who was cast as the rape victim.
Oh.
Kubrick's notes on her repeatedly focused on her huge breasts and her tart quality.
Considering the violent scene she was being cast for, to reduce her to a sexual fantasy object, that shows a really appalling lack of sensitivity.
It highlights a professional environment where women were often treated as sexual objects first and professional actors second. And this archival evidence is so important because it's empirical proof of a problematic power dynamic right at the heart of his creative process.
Okay, let's move on to the problematic labor relations. This seems to directly contradict that image of the principled artist fighting against the system. It sounds like he was fighting against basic workers' rights.
He fundamentally saw trade unions and labor regulations as a barrier to film production. His longtime assistant, Emilio D'Alessandro, wrote in his memoirs about how Kubrick would encourage staff to stay non-union so he could get the maximum number of working hours out of them.
He just wanted them available all the time.
He asked them to devote their entire lives to the job. D'Alessandro even got divorced because of it. Kubrick's thinking was, it's a waste of time to stop work at 6. I need you to be there when I need you. He demanded absolute commitment, overriding their personal lives and any labor standards.
But the most damning evidence is from the production of 2001, where he blames unions for budget overruns.
The correspondence in the archive is incredibly revealing. There's a 1966 letter he wrote to the president of MGM, Robert O'Brien, where he explicitly blames the budget problems on new union agreements that set maximum daily working hours and required breaks. He claimed they increased his costs by 25%.
And what was his justification for saying that a worker's break was wasted time?
His argument was all about perfection. He complained that union rules made it hard to get the perfect take if you were, as he said, one take away from getting a scene perfect. He argued that having to stop and send the crew home for a mandated break meant losing momentum, and that was an unacceptable waste to him.
So his artistic vision took priority over everything.
Over the safety, sanity, and rights of his crew? Yeah. And that philosophy continued throughout his career. During Full Metal Jacket, the crew was working in this incredibly hazardous, toxic old gas works, breathing in all sorts of dust and waste.
And he still complained about breaks.
Archival material confirms he was seen ridiculing them for needing regular tea breaks. He was just prepared to ignore his workers' health and their basic rights to get his vision on screen.
Okay, finally, let's talk about him leveraging his power for tax breaks. This is him wielding his influence in the UK political sphere.
Right. By the mid-70s, Kubrick was an incredibly wealthy and influential figure living in England. And at that time, the Labour Party proposed a new annual wealth tax, specifically for foreign residents. The policy was aimed at taxing their worldwide earnings up to 83%. It was a major attempt to address wealth inequality.
And Kubrick fought against it.
Aggressively. The archives show correspondence where he's working with powerful British industry figures like Sir John Wolfe to lobby hard against it.
Hmm.
And he played his biggest card. He threatened to leave. He cited the huge economic contribution he made to the UK, arguing he'd brought in $27 million in spending through his films.
So the threat was, if you tax me, I'll take my whole industry and all that money elsewhere.
Precisely. And he joined other powerful producers in arguing that the government would lose more than it could possibly gain by driving them out. And this aggressive campaign by these powerful, wealthy figures was a direct contributor to the Labour government eventually dropping the policy.
So it's the ultimate paradox. The genius who dissects the absurdity of power in his films was simultaneously objectifying women, exploiting his workers, and lobbying a democratic government to protect his own vast wealth.
And that's what the archival research gives us, a complete unsanitized picture. We have to synthesize this Kubrick paradox, the same relentless, meticulous obsession that gave us this groundbreaking visual perfection and this penetrating critique of civilization's flaws, also fueled a self-serving myth that hid some really questionable managerial and ethical practices.
This is so critical because it's bigger than just film history. It's a lens on how power works in any creative system. We have to accept that the art we celebrate is often totally divorced from the producer's conduct and the conditions it was made under.
Exactly. When we study history, especially art made by these powerful figures, we have a responsibility to look past the myth they so carefully built for themselves. The archive shows us the empirical reality of how Stanley Kubrick used his power, and it contrasts so sharply with the moral scrutiny he applied to the subjects in his art.
Which leaves us with a really important final question for you, the learner, to think about as we wrap up this deep dive.
If the archival evidence reveals that the celebrated perfection of Kubrick's films was often achieved through this kind of questionable conduct objectification, exploitation of labor, leveraging wealth against social policy, does that empirical reality fundamentally change how we should value or study or even interpret the finished work?
Right. Does the knowledge of that human cost actually diminish the artistic achievement? When you watch Barry Lyndon now and you think about what it took to get those candlelight scenes, or you think about the context of those A Clockwork Orange casting notes, that's a profound ethical and artistic reckoning for you to mull over.